Hi, welcome back to our continued discussion on global oil reserves. Today we're going to talk about some of the newer reserves of oil that have been found and exploited globally, and I would say about the last 10 to 30 years. So one of the most sought after sources of global oil now is Arctic oil. Until about the last 20 years, this was not considered to be accessible because the Arctic was too harsh of an environment to live in. Unfortunately, or not to live in, but even to work in or drill for oil in. Unfortunately, because of global climate change, a lot of the ice caps in the Arctic are melting and exposing more areas that are available for drilling. And their U.S. Geologic Survey estimates that there's about 240 billion barrels of oil and natural gas in the Arctic, most of it offshore. So this is a huge resource that a lot of countries are interested in. Right now, this is about 10% of the world's existing conventional resources. And as I said, climate change is opening up the Arctic to extraction and development as the Arctic begins to warm. So there are 6 global countries that stake a claim to Arctic oil, and this is based upon the idea that the continental shelf that makes up your country has to travel under the ocean and connect in some way to the Arctic. This applies to 6 countries worldwide: the United States via Alaska, Russia via northern Russia and Siberia. Canada has the largest probably, except for Russia, border with the Arctic. Norway and Iceland, and Denmark via Greenland. So currently, 4 countries are actively drilling in the Arctic: the US, Russia, Canada, and Norway. The most prevalent of these is Russia, and Russia has gone after Arctic oil and staking a claim to Arctic oil far more aggressively than any of the other countries. So there's a lot of challenges to extracting Arctic oil. Even with global climate change, the Arctic is still an extreme climate. The shrinking ice will begin to exacerbate this. So icebergs might collide with drilling rigs if we're talking about offshore oil drilling. Waves and storms are going to become bigger, and the weathers are going to become less predictable. So this is going to be a very harsh climate for people to work in and for oil rigs to exist in. It's going to be very expensive to extract Arctic oil because of the harsh climate and the manpower issue. There's not a high population density of people who live in the Arctic, so workers are going to have to be imported into that region. No matter where oil drilling occurs, there's always a potential for spills. Cold water in the Arctic makes the cleanup far more difficult, and again, you don't have a lot of manpower, so there's not going to be a lot of people working the oil rigs to handle cleanup. And the Arctic ecosystems are very, very fragile. So these ecosystems, from the tiniest fish that are eaten by the larger fish that feed seals, polar bears, etc., all of these ecosystems would be harmed if some type of spill were to occur in the Arctic areas. A lot of political things that are tied up here. Some of the 6 countries that stake a claim to Arctic oil have signed the Kyoto Agreement, and more recently the Paris Accords. Now, just because these countries have signed these agreements don't mean these countries live up to their agreements. But continuing to exploit Arctic oil is going to increase climate change emissions globally. There's a lot of environmental concerns for the ecosystem, and as I said, Russia is being the most aggressive in its claims for Arctic oil. So there could be, if you've watched the news recently or in the last, say, 70 years, you know that there are political differences between the United States and Russia or the one-time Soviet Union. So people are concerned about the buildup of another Cold War associated with claims to Arctic oil. Right. Another potential source of oil for the United States is in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. This is a 19 million acre tract of land on the Arctic coastline of North Alaska, bordering Canada. The Arctic National Wildlife Reserve was first created in 1980 as the largest protected wilderness in the United States. It's a very sensitive environment and is the breeding ground for the porcupine, caribou, and animals that are important to the indigenous peoples of the region. Within the Greater Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, we call it ANWR, Section 1002 is a 1.5 million acres set aside for possible oil exploration and development. In order for this to happen, we would have to have approval of a U.S. President, U.S. Senate, and U.S. House of Representatives simultaneously to allow this. What this really in modern day politics says is that we have to have a Republican president, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. So after about 50 attempts for congressional Republicans to try this, with their efforts being thwarted either by Presidents Clinton, Obama, Carter, Democratic presidents, finally in 2017, we had the combination of Republican-controlled presidency, Congress, and Senate, and approval was passed, but amid much controversy. Okay. So, some of the reasons to talk about potentially opening up Section 1002 for oil exploration and development. One could make the case that this is a domestic oil source, so it will lessen our reliance on foreign oil and improve the trade deficit in the United States. And as tensions in the Middle East continue to heighten, and the Middle East has remained a very tense region of the world for about the last 60, 70 years, anything that can help get the United States less involved in the Middle East has the potential to be a good thing for us. There is already oil exploration and development on that northern coastline of Alaska in Prudhoe Bay. So a lot of the infrastructure is already there. And the Alaska pipeline travels from Prudhoe Bay, which is on the Arctic, all the way across Alaska to the southern coastline, where there are ships that can then take the oil to oil refineries along the U.S. West Coast, or even to sell the oil and ship it to countries like China and Japan. Right now, there's about 7.7 billion barrels of oil, we think, in Section 1002, in additional to some natural gas. So again, that could help the United States rely a little bit less on foreign oil. There's a lot of Alaskans who support oil drilling in their state, mainly because it creates jobs. Now, the disclaimer to this is all Alaskans over the age of 18 get a check every year for a couple of $1,000s from year to year, depending upon the oil market, just based upon oil revenue money to the state. So it makes sense that most Alaskans would support opening up this area. Another argument in favor of this is that the drilling that's been going on in Prudhoe Bay for quite a while has not been found to impact the caribou herds as much as was anticipated. So it might not be as big a problem as people think it would be. Now, all of that said, there are a lot of concerns with opening up this area for Arctic exploration. One is the basic desire to keep ANWR as a wildlife reserve. A lot of First Nations people oppose this because the porcupine caribou are very important to them, and this is their calving grounds. It may also threaten, drilling in this area may also threaten the bowhead whales, which again are an important food source and culturally important animal to Native Americans. Another reason against doing this is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says this area has a greater degree of ecological diversity than any other Alaska North Slope area. But the Arctic environment is very, very sensitive. So any damage that's done can take hundreds of years or more to be repaired. And we already know from Prudhoe Bay and from the Alaska Pipeline that drilling will result in more spills, damaging the fragile environment. Periodically, there are spills from the Alaska Pipeline. So it's not even just in that area, but along the length of the pipeline, oil spills damage a very fragile environment and ecosystems. An important thing to know about this, a couple of them. One, this will not reduce oil or gas prices. Even if oil exploration in the area or oil development started tomorrow, it's going to be probably at least a year or more before we would see any of that oil. There's also no guarantee that that oil would come to the United States. The United States would sell oil leases to oil companies, and those oil companies would then drill for the oil, and they could sell it to whoever they want to. Some of it would be sold to the United States, to the different oil companies in the United States. We should always remember we have a capitalistic free market society, so the United States government does not own any oil companies, drill for oil, or sell oil. The United States would merely sell or lease the right for private companies like Shell and Exxon, Texaco to drill for oil in the Arctic. So this is not going to reduce oil or gas prices because there's only about a 6-month supply in the area based upon current U.S. consumption. Any increased production from ANWR could be offset by Saudi Arabia or other countries decreasing production to maintain stable oil prices. And of course, the new jobs that people would want in this area would be temporary, only as long as the oil lasted. Okay. So a really big global oil supply, okay, across a lot of regions in the United States and the rest of the world, but Canada more than anyone else, are oil sands. So oil sands are any type of oil reserves that are held in loose sand or soft sandstone containing bitumen. Bitumen is really what is being extracted. It's a heavy mixture of crude oil. And from this heavy mixture of crude oil, the type quality of petroleum that we use to run our cars can be refined. So again, the biggest global reserves of this are in Canada and Venezuela. The reserves could make Canada and Venezuela second and third behind Saudi Arabia in oil production. Currently, Canada is extracting this, and as we saw from previous slides, Canada is a very big global oil producer because of this reserve. For reasons of economic collapse, too big to discuss in this lecture, Venezuela is not making use of their oil sand reserves. There are some lesser reserves in Russia and in Kazakhstan. But again, Canada is the biggest producer of oil sands. They could meet all of North America's needs for about the next 100 years with what they have in recoverable oil. And this is why the U.S. imports more oil from Canada than any other country right now. Just the simple ease of the fact that we can have pipelines carry the oil, the crude oil straight from Canada to the United States makes this a lot easier than using ships to bring oil from, say, Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or Kuwait to the United States. Now, that said, this is not a completely clean process, and we'll talk about some of the problems associated with it here in a minute. This oil sand is far more expensive to extract than conventional oil. It takes a lot of energy to refine this bitumen into a usable oil, and again, transportation is an issue. So, where these are located, if we look at Alberta, Canada, so they're second to the most furthest western province in Canada. If you go north, you'll see here in the orange areas where the Athabasca oil sands are currently being exploited. Now, unlike conventional oil, this is not oil that is drilled for. This is obtained via surface mining. Okay? And again, as I said, the pipeline system carries this oil to refineries across the United States, which has now made Canada the biggest foreign oil supplier, especially to the United States. Okay. So some of the problems with extracting tar sands. Okay. This is a type of oil that is surface mined for. So in Canada, in Athabasca, they go in and they dig big pits of 130 to 200 feet deep of these oil sands. They remove the water, clay, and other soil off of, or stripped first off the land. And then underneath that, you've got the oil sands that are removed. So you've got these really big open pit mines. When you take the mixture of the oil with the bitumen, you then have to mix water with it to separate the bitumen from the sand mixture. So it's a very water-intensive process. And the bitumen is then mixed with lighter hydrocarbons so that it can be transported via pipeline. Otherwise, it's too thick of a slurry to be easily pumped and piped long distances. Okay. So some of the big environmental concerns of tar sands. Number one is that strip mining removes large amounts of surface land that can never be restored to its original form. This is a water-intensive process, so pollution of adjacent rivers and lakes is a common occurrence with strip mining. The process of converting the sand bitumen mixture and separating the two involves some harmful chemicals that are held in ponds. These can include acids and carcinogenic compounds, and there have been documented leaks of these in Athabasca, but also in other places in the United States where strip mining of coal is done. So the entire process is just fraught with environmental peril. Many pipeline spills have already occurred across the United States and Canada. If you've watched the news in the United States in recent years, you've seen that where the oil companies want to build more pipelines that carry this Canadian oil across the Dakotas and Montana, heading all the way south to oil refineries as far south as Houston, Texas. Native Americans have really objected to and fought having these pipelines cross their lands because of the potential for oil spills. And many oil spills have already happened, so this is not an empty concern that people have. In mining areas, you also get, in additional to potential water pollution and spills that will contaminate soil and water, you also get increased air pollution from particulate matter, NOx, which can be NO2 or NO3, CO2, which is, of course, the #1 global climate change, chemical and volatile organic compounds. So there's some interesting geopolitics of Canada's oil sands. Both the United States and China want more Canadian oil. The United States, it makes sense. We've always had good diplomatic relationships with Canada. We share a very long border with Canada. It's a lot easier to import oil from Canada than across the ocean from Middle Eastern countries. China has Sinopec, which is their largest oil refinery and oil company. Now, the difference between the United States and China is the United States is a free market economy. There are no government-owned oil companies to purchase any shares or interest in Canadian oil. Sinopec, on the other hand, because China is a communist country, the Chinese government owns and controls Sinopec. So the Chinese government has been purchasing major shares in these Canadian oil companies. Probably won't happen, but if it does, and the Chinese government purchases a controlling amount, the U.S. could lose some of their oil imports from Canada. There's been a proposed pipeline from Alberta heading west to a coastal port in British Columbia that would help and expedite shipping oil directly to China. Now, again, for all of the reasons that we've discussed about oil spills from pipelines and water and soil contamination, First Nations and environmental groups oppose the building of these pipelines. We already have these systems in the United States. While they're very convenient in some aspects, again, the environmental aspect of these oil pipelines doesn't have a really great track record. Okay. So, one of the things that we want to talk about is the environmental impacts of all petroleum sources. Okay. Climate change, the major byproduct of petroleum combustion is CO2. That's the biggest climate change gas. N2O, which is an agricultural fertilizer, is also petroleum-based, and it is also a very big global climate change gas. Other environmental impacts of petroleum, CO2 in the atmosphere creates more carbonic acid in the oceans, which is acidifying our oceans, damaging and killing coral reefs and sensitive fish species. Oil extraction damages land, especially when you're talking about things like surface mining, and it causes poor air quality. Hydraulic fracturing, that we'll talk about in a little bit in another lecture, pollutes groundwater, has caused an increase in earthquakes, and also increases air pollution. And anytime you have drilling for oil, surface mining for oil, you're going to have oil spills, which damages land and water ecosystems, is devastating for seabirds and land animals. And there's a whole list of cases that we can talk about. The Deepwater Horizon that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, the Exxon Valdez that happened off the coastline of southern Alaska, many in the Niger Delta in the country of Nigeria, many oil spills in damaged lands in Venezuela, and the list could just go on and on. Okay. Now, another source outside of conventional oil that we can talk about are shale and oil and natural gas reserves. And we have a lot of these across the United States. So this is oil that's held in soft, porous shale rock formations. This material was used in the early 1900s for lamp oil, but wasn't refined to usable petroleum. It was exploited a little bit during World War II, but Middle Eastern oil was a lot easier and less expensive to obtain, so the United States got out of that business after World War II. But now, in the early 2000s, we have hydraulic fracturing technology that's allowing us to get after these type of oil reserves. So shale oil reserves are exploited quite a bit in the United States and in Russia, and they're being exploited more across China and Brazil and Estonia and a couple of European countries like Poland. Okay. Main U.S. deposits of shale oil exist in the Green River Formation. So the Green River runs from northwest Colorado, northeast Utah, okay, down or up through southwest Wyoming, okay, where the Green River in southern Colorado merges with the Colorado River that then continues to travel through Arizona and into California. So this area of northwest Colorado, northeast Utah, southwest Wyoming has quite a bit of these formations. Others across the United States exist in Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about these more when we talk about hydraulic fracturing, Texas, Oklahoma, and New York. So you can either get at this with surface mining or hydraulic fracturing, primarily now through hydraulic fracturing. Okay. So how do these things compare to your traditional petroleum resources? Number one, they are more expensive to extract and process. We talked about the challenges associated with Arctic oil, the energy requirement of converting bitumen, separating it from sand and converting that into a usable petroleum, and the kerogen from shale oil into a usable petroleum. So this is among a number of reasons, one of many, why gas prices are considerably higher now than they used to be. It also has a lower energy content. And there's a much, much greater environmental impact associated with either drilling for Arctic oil, surface mining, or hydraulic fracturing to get at these harder to reach resources. So you've got land use issues. Surface mining creates fluff of the shale if you surface mine for the shale oil, which creates waste disposal problems. These processes use a lot of water. If you were to go out to the northwestern Colorado, northeastern Utah area, what you would see is it's a fairly water scarce area of the country. So you have a high level of water use in an area that is water scarce. All of these processes emit more greenhouse gas emissions, so more global climate change problems, and they create water pollution. They have been measured in the Green River, which is important because the Green River empties to the Colorado River, which is used as a freshwater source, drinking water, for some people who live in Arizona, and then agricultural waters into Southern California. So all of these are different environmental concerns associated with these different types of oil reserves. So we'll leave off here for today, and we'll take up our next topic tomorrow.